All right, so now we're moving into chapter 23 content, or excuse me, chapter 20 content. This content will go over the very end of this time period and look more at cross-cultural interaction. So first we're going to start off by looking at the Crusades. The Crusades, you might think to yourself, cross-cultural interaction, weren't they pretty violent? But a lot of exchanging of ideas happened. The first Crusade was called in 1095 by Pope Urban, I believe, but I might be incorrect on that. I don't have a fact sheet next to me telling me that. So 1095, and it was called to go to the Holy Land because the Holy Land, and this was something that the Byzantine Empire had really been pushing as another Christian empire. This little pink stuff over here. Um, and it was called to the Holy Land. The first one didn't get too far, but the last crusade then was in 1348, and there were a whole host of crusades. Some of them successful, some of them not successful. I guess it depends on what you define as crusade, or in what you define as success. But the last crusade was in 1348, according to my sources, and it was actually to Finland, to get people in Finland to practice Christianity. So one of the false assumptions about the Crusades is that they were just to the Holy Land or just to the Middle East. That's not true. They were also in Europe, in Spain, like the Reconquista was part of this idea of the Crusades, trying to further the practice of Christianity. The Second Crusade was the most successful, but almost all the rest of them failed. In the Second Crusade, that's when a lot of these Christian castles were set up. I'll try to highlight those so you can see them a little bit better. And this is where a lot of, that's just making them green. This is where a lot of the knights were stayed, and a lot of their orders were set down. So again, they are the blue castles on the map. The green ones are Muslim castles. Yeah, so they set up Christian kingdoms, but they lost all of this territory except for a very minimal, castle outposts after the Second Crusade. The Fourth Crusade actually never made it to the Holy Land, and instead, this was after the Great Schism happened, and the Venetians had called on the Christians to have a crusade. It doesn't. Not going to tell me how to spell Venetian. So the Venetians had called on the Western Christians to have this crusade because they felt like they were in competition, or they were in competition with the Byzantine Empire for control of the Mediterranean, and they wanted more riches. So the Venetians, kind of promote this crusade, and this crusade stops in Constantinople and sacks the city. And if you want to read some really crazy primary sources, read the sources about the Crusaders attacking Constantinople. They take a bunch of stuff back, which is what we saw in St. Mark's. This actually increased economic and commercial opportunities because when the Europeans got to these lands, they were like, wow, this stuff is amazing. Citrus, books, book binding, a printing press. Oh my gosh, remember that guy Aristotle? This book is about Aristotle. I totally forgot he existed. Wow. So there were all kinds of increased economic and commercial opportunities. Silk, just tons of stuff that people wanted. This is a picture of the sacking of Constantinople. Not only were people interacting through conquest, but they were also interacting through trade. Marco Polo is one of the only explorers that we know about that actually traveled the complete route of the Silk Roads. And so he traveled out to basically out to China and back. And while he was there, he experienced Mongol China, so the Yuan dynasty. And then he returned back by sea to Venice. And when he got back to Venice, he got there in a time of war. And while he was in his cell, he had his cellmate write the travels of Marco Polo, which became like a best-selling book. It was like the Hunger Games of its time. The Harry Potter of its time. Everybody wanted to read this book, and it really got people more interested in travel and in the East. Now, there was a lot of crazy stuff in that book that probably wasn't true, but we've already looked at a source from it, or we will look at a source from it. The effects of cross-cultural interaction were pretty massive. So there was the spread of technology. So gunpowder spread through the Mongol Empire to the Arabs and then to the Europeans. This had a huge effect in the Hundred Years' War, which I think we'll talk about on the last slide. Also, we have the printing press. Johannes Gutenberg got those ideas from somewhere, sorry, and that was also from the East. It originated in China. Also, using paper, less expensive than parchment. This also spread foods. The whole idea of a fruit cake comes from this time period, preserving those citrus fruits, which came from the Arab world. Europeans went gaga for that stuff. They also had all of these sweet spices like nutmeg. This really propelled the Europeans to want to travel and trade more to get these ridiculously delicious spices. And another thing that they were introduced to by the Arab world was sugar, and they really loved sugar. This also spread culture, especially philosophers like Aristotle, which, like I said, were incorporated into the scholastic work of Christianity. Another thing that happens when a lot of people interact with each other is the spreading of disease. The Black Death broke out in the 1330s in China. In the province that it broke out in, it killed 80 to 90% of the population. And it was spread along trade routes to Europe, and it reached Italy in 1848. It was, even though it came in 1348, then every 5, 10, 15 years, you would have another resurgence of the Black Death. So it didn't just go away. It was carried by fleas on rats on trading ships that had come from ports in the Black Sea. So as you can see, it spread through Europe pretty rapidly. We're going to look at another map that's better in class, but you can just get the idea from this map where it spread when. And it had a massive effect on populations. In China, it led to the destruction of the Mongol Khanates and the resurgence of tradition with the Ming Dynasty. And China recovered from it pretty quickly. In Europe, there, as the huge decrease of population, and we'll look at the Black Death more in class. I don't want you to think this is the only thing you're going to hear about it, but pay close attention to these effects, because we will go over these in class. But this is something that you're getting a lot from in the PowerPoint. Because there was this huge power, there was this huge loss of life. Part of that was these regional lords, and so there was a big centralization of regional states. So the places like France and England took this opportunity to become more of a dominant center of power. They did this by improving tax collection. So they started to use census data, and they started to legislate more taxes, because not as much money was going to local lords. That meant that they could have standing armies, which was really important because they were fighting a lot of wars to try to gain more territory. Wars like the 100 Years' War, which ends in the 1400s. That's the one Joan of Arc was a part of. It's between France and England. At the beginning of that war, they were using bows and arrows. At the end, they're using cannons, which shows you the proliferation of technology that you get from trade. Also, peasants, there were a lot less of them. And because there were a lot less of them, they were more valuable. So they started to say, hey, serfdom is not good for us. They started to have a lot of uprisings against the people who were controlling them, and this led to their freedom or emancipation and changing of that system. Also, this really challenged religion, because because religion wasn't doing anything to stop the plague. Here you can see, so this is a priest, priest John Ball, who was encouraging peasant revolt in Kent, England. So it was that, again, that combining of like the church and state and the freedom of the peasants. I hope that this long flipped classroom has given you a little bit of context for medieval Europe and the important pieces of it, the feudalism, the role and the rising role of Christianity, and the role of cities within Europe in that isolated time. Don't forget to do the listening checks. Have a good day.